The cow is the purest type of subhuman life. Gandhi. Now, I don't personally recall ever reading the word subhuman in such a flattering sentence. Now, while not the most intelligent animal,
Oh, you dumb fucker.
nor the most graceful animal,
More cows. Oh, that one's shitting. Oh, no.
cattle have played a profound role in human history. This is a creature that, through its digestive power of 4 stomachs, or more accurately 1 stomach and 4 compartments, can turn cellulose in grass, of which our bodies are unable to process, into meat and milk, which we can digest. This has provided sustenance for a vast array of people, from ancient farmers of Mesopotamia to Texan grill masters, from the Mongolians out on the open plains of the Eurasian steppe, to the vegetarian Hindus of India who refuse to eat the cow's flesh but will acquire nutrients from their milk. Their utility, if you could call it that, has been used to produce a wide variety of goods and services, from plowing the fields to leather jackets and even jello. Cattle are bovine ungulates. Ungulates are a clade of large animals which either have hooves or have relatively recent ancestors who had hooves. A large group containing a vast array of mammalian megafauna, from horses to hippos, llamas to marine mammals like dolphins, which trace their ancestry back to the land. Cattle are by far the most successful species of these ungulates when it comes to their aggregate numbers, but oftentimes fail quite miserably when it comes to their quality of life. One of the subcategorizations that cattle belong to are bovines. All bovines are ungulates, but not all ungulates are bovines. This group is composed of animals with 2 toes, and the males almost always have horns. This group includes the water buffalo, African buffalo, American bison, and various others. The ancestors of modern-day cows are not actually African buffaloes or American bison or the yak as many think, but rather the extinct aurochs, a mighty beast that, during the Ice Age of man's early past, had arranged most likely starting in parts of Asia, before moving into the Indian subcontinent, the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe. Most of the megafauna of the Pleistocene epoch that we typically think of as the Ice Age were considerably larger than those animals that we see today. The Americas had giant camels, Australia had giant kangaroos, and of course there were the iconic woolly mammoths, woolly rhinos, and saber-toothed cats. However, most of them would not survive the introduction of humans, as their large size made them targets, and their slow gestation periods prevented them from rebounding their numbers. The aurochs met a similar fate as most of these famous creatures that roam the tundra, however with 2 major distinctions. For one, their extinction happened far later than that of the giant sloth and the mastodons. While the last remnants of the woolly mammoth populations were roaming the earth during the time of the pyramids before shortly going extinct afterwards, the aurochs went extinct in the wild as recent as the Middle Ages, with the last remnants found in Eastern Europe across bogs and forests. They most likely died a natural death, unlike their domesticated counterparts. Speaking of those domesticated counterparts, what really kept the aurochs separated from, say, dire wolves and ground sloths of the Stone Age that went extinct was the fact that they were partially domesticated. Remnants of the aurochs have been found in Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and other regions in what are now Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. These were most likely the remains of just less than 100 aurochs, roughly 10,000 years ago. However, it was not a one-way street, as the domestication was more widespread. Wild aurochs did breed with domesticated cattle on occasion, similar to how wolves sometimes breed with dogs. The Middle East was not the only place to domesticate these beasts. A little later, the Indian subcontinent had domesticated cattle called zebu. If you have ever seen cows from India, you have probably noticed that they have a fat hump on their shoulders and a flap on their neck. They are well adapted to the subtropical and monsoon climates, and they have played a far more revered role in India than any other species of cattle, or more accurately breed of cattle, in other parts of the world respectively. Another region to quasi-domesticate cattle is Africa. During much of the Stone Age, the Sahara had much more foliage, making it easier to transport livestock, not to mention the ever-growing power of Egypt along the Nile. Eventually, these domesticated Middle Eastern cattle would find their way to sub-Saharan Africa. Africans probably did not domesticate their own buffalo species, having co-evolved with humans. The fight or flight response to bipedal apes was more intense, unlike their Eurasian counterparts, who were less afraid of humans. This made African buffalo and water buffalo far harder to domesticate. Nonetheless, domesticated aurochs from the Middle East arrived and interbred with wild aurochs of North Africa, alongside the zebu populations brought from India. This emerging group of African cattle are now known as the Senga. It's worth pointing out that some experts do believe that the African aurochs were domesticated separately in sub-Saharan Africa around the great African freshwater lakes. There is growing genetic evidence of Africans domesticating cattle independently. However, it's not conclusive yet, and we still need to wait for more evidence. Nonetheless, their uses for meat, milk, leather, manure, and plowing the fields would make them a very common domesticated animal in Europe and East Asia as well. However, they did not arrive in the Americas or Australia until the arrival of Europeans in those regions, as the aurochs did not live in those parts of the world. The widespread utility of cattle did play a role in why the Americas, and even more so Australia, were not as technologically advanced, as they did not support the same population numbers as Afro-Eurasia. Speaking of which, let's get to why cattle are so useful. As you have heard, cattle have 4 stomachs. That's sort of true. They actually have 1 stomach with 4 major sections. These creatures live off of grasses that are pretty much made up of cellulose, which is impossible for us to digest properly. However, they actually can't digest it properly either. They have to regurgitate their food called chud, which is kind of like re-chewing their partial vomit. Isn't that appetizing? The microbiome of their gut, or guts, breaks down the tough cellulose into fatty acids that can provide the massive beasts with energy, as well as the ability to turn those amino acids into proteins, which make up their muscles that we eat. It's pretty remarkable how such a powerful animal can be fueled by something as basic as grass. The ability to turn grass, which is inedible for humans, into meat and milk, which can provide us with very rich calories that we can digest, allowed humans to spread throughout the grasslands that were not fertile or wet enough to grow starchy crops like rice, wheat, or corn. To this day, many nomadic peoples in Mongolia and Tibet rely on cattle alongside camels, goats, sheep, and horses, which can chew the grasses and provide them with sustenance, and in turn provide sustenance to those nomadic peoples. On top of that, they're also relatively easy to breed for an animal of their size. Not to the same extent of pigs or chickens, but neither pigs or chickens can produce ribeye steak, and they're much smaller. Cattle were also yoked to plow the fields. This meant that humans not only got cows to provide them with meat and dairy, but also crops indirectly, as a manure provided fertilizer, and they provided the physical power to push carts. However, they were later replaced with the horse, and then by tractors, due to their superior strength. However, to this day, oxen, which are basically cows attached to a yoke, are still used in sub-Saharan Africa, and subsistence farmers in India. Before the invention of actual coins and paper money, cattle were frequently used in trade as barter. Cows may have even been a precursor to the coin or paper bill, as one of the earliest forms of currency, although it may be difficult to fit one in your wallet. And in death, after the flesh was consumed, the skin could be used for hides, providing protection from the rain while retaining some heat in modestly cool temperatures. Cattle have also shown signs of sexual dimorphism, with the calcium in the bull's body being used to produce horns and the calcium in the cow's body being used to produce milk for calves. Over the course of domestication, more docile cattle were bred over the course of this time, as opposed to more aggressive cattle, resulting in creatures that won't ram you to death. To this day, the sexual dimorphism has resulted in very different perspectives on bulls and cows in human cultures. Bulls are usually depicted as symbols of strength, aggression, protection, and masculinity. This can be seen in various cultures such as the Minoans of ancient Crete to the bullfighters of Spain. Side note, Even in countries where bullfighting has been historically popular, this has declined rapidly in many parts of the Hispanic world, including Spain, and has even been banned in certain subregions. Football and Xbox tend to be more interesting to watch, and they're not quite as weird and flamboyant as genderqueer macho manlets trying to kill a bull. In Spain, there is an event called the Running of the Bulls in the city of Pamplona, which I'm mispronouncing, in which a bunch of dumb drunk tourists get the chance to use a bullhorn as a butt plug. To this day, bulls are the national animal of Spain and symbols of the Spaniards' strength, machismo, and resilience. Cows, on the other hand, play a more feminine role, a motherly role when it comes to their depictions in human culture, which makes sense since they nurture their young and produce milk, not only for their calves but also humans. Adult humans don't need dairy. However, pastoral nomads used milk and other products made from it to provide subsistence across the plains. This was alongside goats and sheep. You can even see the prevalence of lactose intolerance among populations of people like Han Chinese, where pastoralism was not as common as it was in, say, Mongolia. In ancient Egypt, one of the iconic mother goddesses, Hathor, was oftentimes depicted with the head or body of a cow, resembling femininity, fertility, and motherhood. In Norse mythology, you get a supernatural mother cow who lets the ancestors of the giants feed off of her udder. Now, I personally would not recommend sucking milk straight from a cow's teats, though. We'll get to that when we move on to pasteurization. The region, most well known for the popularity of the cow, is of course India. The Zebu cattle are considered sacred in Hinduism. Hinduism, as well as offshoot religions like Buddhism and Jainism, tend to be far less centered on humans than Abrahamic religions like Christianity and Islam. Humans in Hinduism are seen part of a wider cosmic cycle, connected with beasts more so than completely above them. And this is not to say that there are no hierarchies in Hinduism, because, hello, there's a caste system, but it does mean that Hinduism tends to place more importance on animal welfare than, say, Judaism, Christianity, or Islam. This partially explains why people in the Indian subcontinent consume far less meat than any other part of the world, and have more vegetarians than anywhere else. Veganism, however, is not as common, as most Hindus don't have a problem with consuming milk, cooking with ghee or clarified butter, or for that matter, eating paneer cheese, as it doesn't involve killing the animal. To this day, veganism is by and large a product of the developed world. In India, vegetarianism is very common, but many Hindus also eat other types of meat, such as chickens. However, cows are not eaten commonly by Hindus, as cows are considered sacred in Hinduism. And beef, by and large, is rarely consumed in India, at least not when it comes to its Hindu majority population. However, many Muslim Indians do eat beef, which has resulted in cultural tensions between Hindus and Muslims. The most notable example of this are the Hindu nationalist beef brigades, who oftentimes attack Muslims for eating beef. The Jains of India, on the other hand, actually stand against killing not only cows, but all animals due to their stance on nonviolence. Buddhists, by and large, can also prohibit beef depending on their circumstances, and for that matter, all meat. However, those in Mongolia and Tibet oftentimes will eat beef and other types of meat due to their alpine and desert climates, which make it very difficult to decide off of a vegetarian diet, given how hard it is to grow crops in those regions. However, with the modernization and industrialization, urbanization, and the growing influence of capitalism, you do see a resurgence of vegetarianism in the commercial urban areas. Now, cattle have also played a very important role in Abrahamic religions to a lesser extent. The most notable example being the golden calf from the book of Exodus, being a tale of the God of Israel rejecting false idols and drunken orgies. To this day, Jews and Muslims have dietary restrictions and dietary methods of preparing food, including beef through kosher and halal respectively. As history went on, cattle set foot in new worlds, grazing easily across the grasslands of what are now the Great Plains of North America, providing a livelihood and iconography for the vaqueros and cowboys of Mexico and the United States. On the other side of the Americas, cattle ranching also became huge in southern Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina, leading to the gauchos. To this day, the US and Brazil are the largest producers of beef in the world, even though cattle aren't native to the Americas. Cattle would also be a mainstay of Australian and New Zealand agriculture. Granted, in New Zealand, it would later be outpaced by sheep. However, modern-day farming has proved to be controversial. For one, there's a threat of zoonotic diseases like anthrax and E. coli. On a darker note, cows may have helped the peoples of Afro-Eurasia, namely Europeans, take over much of the Americas, Australia, and the Pacific. After all, Afro-Eurasia had access to cows and the immunity of diseases brought by cows, such as smallpox. Some of the indigenous peoples of the Americas, Australia, and the Pacific did not have any immunity. After all, they didn't interact with cattle. As a result, much of the indigenous populations of these regions were wiped out by and large by diseases once contact was made. And the threat hasn't ended. Anthrax was later used as a bioweapon, and there's no specific cure for certain strains of E. coli. Nonetheless, cows did help us produce vaccines. Cowpox was a disease. Focus on was. Most prominently shown under the udders of cows. This would produce blisters, similar to what smallpox does, but far less dangerous. During the late 1700s, Dr. Edward Jenner, one of the most important people to walk the earth that you've never heard of, had developed a vaccine for pox by subjecting the patient to small amounts of the weakened version of the pathogen in order to produce antibodies. This would play a pivotal role in the foundation for the smallpox vaccine, saving millions of lives. Several decades later, after the emergence of the cowpox vaccine, would be Louis Pasteur, who showed that you could make milk consumption and other foods far safer by subjecting them to heat. Mild heat to kill bacteria, fungi, and parasites. Before pasteurization, drinking milk could oftentimes be dangerous, as milk spoils easily and can give in to foodborne illnesses like salmonella and listeria. To this day, milk can be safely consumed, both on its own and in countless other recipes across diets around the world, albeit less common in some cultures such as those of East Asia. And while it is true that all mammals produce milk to feed their babies, cows are large enough in number and in size and productive enough to produce tons of milk that not only their babies can consume, but also we can consume, and we can make it economically viable. This is the reason why, say, camel milk, which is sometimes consumed, is not particularly popular in supermarkets because camels don't produce milk very efficiently and therefore it's not profitable. Cows are also docile, and it would be a lot harder to milk lionesses and stay alive. However, I'm still waiting on some entrepreneur to find a way to milk a whale and produce cheese out of it. Now, speaking of cheese, in some cultures, namely Europe, and to a lesser extent the Indian subcontinent and the Middle East, humans have used milk to produce cheese by getting the milk protein, known as casein, to coagulate into a solid known as cheese curds. The acidity of milk and its enzymes, along with its microbiome, meant that this would allow the formation of cheese curds to form. The byproduct of this is whey, which is essentially cheesy water, if you could call it that, which is essentially used in baby formula as well as protein powder. Yup, whey is so cool that both babies and bodybuilders love it. Anyway, let's talk about cheese. Unlike milk, cheese usually has a much longer shelf life. One explanation or possible explanation as to why cheese is so popular in Europe is that the climate is cooler and you can store food more easily. You also need to store things over the winter time, and given how cold the winter can get, this leads to the availability of calorie-dense foods with high fat and calcium content during some of the harshest times of the year. In other parts of the world, namely Turkey, milk would be fermented through bacteria to produce lactic acid, which in turn can be used to produce yogurt. Yogurt is lower in calories and is considered healthier than most cheeses by most standards. Its popularity in the Middle East and India has spread to the West through the power of yuppies and hipsters. Let's move on to cream and butter. Cream is the fatty layer, which is skimmed off of the milk, which can create its own wide variety of cooking processes, noted for its thicker texture and heavier flavor. By churning the cream, you can produce butter by spreading the butterfat into various solids, eventually producing buttermilk as a byproduct, a thick acidic liquid oftentimes used in southern US cooking for marination. Butter is also commonly used for cooking oil in many parts of the world that are too cold to, say, grow olives. This may explain why Southern Europe primarily relies upon olive oil, while the Northern European countries by and large prefer butter. However, there are some warm parts of the world, like India, that use ghee or clarified butter by melting the butter and separating the milk fats. Dairy farming is still considered controversial to this day. Even though it doesn't result in the slaughter of cows, it does oftentimes result in the slaughter of bulls, given the fact that they can't produce milk. And they aren't really bred to produce meat either, as they tend to be smaller. Dairy cows are oftentimes locked in small enclosures and still produce a tremendous amount of greenhouse gases. For these reasons, we have seen alternatives to real milk, such as almond milk and soy milk, which, contrary to what internet memes will tell you, contains plant estrogen, not animal estrogen. So if you're an alpha male watching this, keep in mind that you will not get man tits from drinking soy milk. Meat production is still far more controversial for obvious reasons, given not only the biohazards and living conditions, but also the greenhouse gases. Oh yeah, and I forgot to mention that animals get killed in the process with meat. Speaking of meat, beef tends to be considered less healthy than poultry and seafood for a variety of complex reasons which deserve their own video. Beef is also not as particularly efficient for getting protein. Given the amount of food cattle need to consume, you can only really use 40% of their bodies, as opposed to, say, a cricket, which is 80% of its body that can be eaten. Keep in mind that Westerners tend to not like eating organ meat, which can also be wasteful. Nonetheless, those grazing on open pastures live far better lives. These cattle eat grass, which their digestive system is far more accustomed to than, say, corn, that are oftentimes fed to them in factory farms. The high corn diet on a large scale at commercial farms has led to cows farting and burping a lot, which has created a massive fart fest and burp bonanza that has resulted in a great deal of methane that has been spread into the atmosphere, which proves to be far more detrimental to climate change than, say, CO2. Furthermore, cattle ranching in Brazil is one of the biggest contributors to deforestation. Now, I'm not here to convince you of what your diet should be. That's your choice. I'm just stating the facts. Noting these environmental, ethical, and economic concerns has led to some promoting the idea of reducing beef consumption and production, a difficult task given the rise of people entering the middle class around the world. Granted, veggie burgers and many other meat substitutes have started to taste more like beef and less like, well, sawdust over the past 5 years. There's also been a growing development of lab-grown meat, but this is still a long way to go. This would result in a lot of people losing their livelihoods in the short run through creative destruction, but it would also lead to far less ecological destruction and animal suffering. And you'd get a whole bunch of new job opportunities in the fields of biotech. For a pretty dumb animal, it's quite remarkable how much cattle have spurred human technology. Perhaps in a handful of decades, it will be time to use that more advanced technology to liberate the oxen from their yokes.